My 68th birthday dinner ended the exact moment my adopted son slammed his heavy hand across my face and shouted with a venomous snarl, "I wish I'd never been your son, you ungrateful old hypocrite." 4 of my closest neighborhood friends sat completely frozen around the dining table, their jaws slack with disbelief. One of them laughed nervously to break the agonizing tension, while another neighbor sitting directly across from me shamelessly raised her smartphone, keeping the camera rolling to capture every single second of my public humiliation. Within a few short hours, that vicious video would be uploaded to Facebook, where millions of strangers across the state of Tennessee would watch me transform from a respected local mechanic into a pathetic, discarded old father publicly degraded by his own flesh and blood. But the next morning, a dying doctor's desperate phone call would uncover a staggering 38-year secret that would turn my son's entire privileged life completely upside down, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had been hiding a monstrous truth from me for decades. Before we dive deep into the harrowing wreckage of this story, let me pause for a brief moment and ask you a deeply personal question. Have you ever discovered a shattering truth that fundamentally changed everything you ever believed about family, loyalty, and unconditional love? Please leave a quick yes or no in the comment section below right now. Your raw stories and honest perspectives remind me every single day that I am not just speaking out into an empty void. Please note that while this story blends deep real-world emotion with carefully crafted fictionalized details for moral reflection, what truly matters is the eternal lesson beating at the very heart of it. My name is Vernon Miller. For 40 unbroken years, I have owned and operated Miller's Garage and Transmission right here in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I spent 4 decades covered in motor oil, rebuilding transmissions, opening up the shop before dawn, and working late into the night so I could provide a secure, comfortable life for my family. I raised Kyle from the day he was brought home from the hospital, walking him through scraped knees, little league games, high school graduation, numerous failed business ventures he dragged me into, and a mountain of broken promises he left in his wake. And yet, there I stood inside my own dining room, tasting the warm, metallic tang of blood from where his heavy signet ring had violently split my lip, watching my 38-year-old son's chest heave with a dark, consuming rage he had apparently been swallowing down for God knows how long. The birthday evening had started out badly and steadily deteriorated into an absolute disaster. Kyle and his wife, Jessica, had arrived a full hour late, reeking heavily of cheap whiskey and expensive perfume. The birthday cake my neighbor had brought sat completely untouched on the sideboard, its candles unlit and mocking. My invited guests, Hal Sutton and his wife, the hard-working gardeners who lived down the road, had tried their absolute best to make polite small talk. But Jessica kept aggressively tapping away at her illuminated smartphone screen, while Kyle repeatedly poured himself heavy glasses of straight bourbon from my crystal decanter. Then came the inevitable predatory demand that shattered the evening's fragile peace. "Dad, we need to talk about your assets and your estate planning," Kyle announced abruptly, his voice entirely too loud and aggressive for a quiet 6-person family dinner table. "Jessica and I have crunched the numbers, and we think it's high time you finalize some legal arrangements before it's too late." Jessica leaned forward across the mahogany wood, her smile sharp, predatory, and entirely devoid of warmth. "What on earth are you keeping all that hoarded money for, Vernon?" she chimed in, her tone dripping with manufactured concern. "You aren't a young man anymore. $3 million sitting in various accounts just collecting dust while you continue living like a hermit in this drafty old house is completely absurd. I had worked 40 grueling years for every single cent of that money. 40 years of brutal physical labor, oil changes in freezing bays, transmission rebuilds, early mornings and missed holidays. Every single dollar had been earned with my own calloused hands, saved meticulously and invested wisely. The auto repair shop belonged entirely to me. The house belonged to me. The accumulated savings belonged to me. I worked 40 years for that money," I said quietly, keeping my voice level despite the rising tide of anger in my chest. "I decide when, how, and where it moves. We aren't asking you to just hand it away blindly, Vernon." Jessica countered smoothly, though her razor-sharp tone suggested precisely the opposite. "We just want you to transfer it into a consolidated family account that we can all legally access for mutual family security, just in case something happens to you. Before something happens to you." Those ominous words hung heavily in the air of the dining room like a calculated threat. "The answer is no," I replied firmly. Kyle stood up so violently from his chair that the wooden legs scraped screechingly across the hardwood floor. "Of course it's no," he exploded, his face flushing a furious crimson. "It's always a flat-out no with you, Dad. No trust, no faith, no belief whatsoever that I could ever actually be good enough to carry on the sacred Miller name." I rubbed my throbbing temple, feeling utterly exhausted. "Kyle, sit down. I'm tired. I'm tired too. His voice cracked, laced with deep self-pity. I'm tired of being your lifelong disappointment. I'm tired of your endless lectures about responsibility while you sit here judging everyone else's life choices. You know what? I wish I'd never been your son. That was the exact moment his open hand swung violently through the air. The physical blow connected with my cheek with such shocking, savage force that I actually heard the air split before his palm struck my flesh. The sharp sound echoed across the quiet dining room like a gunshot, and for one completely frozen second, absolute stillness gripped the table. Not a single one of the 4 neighbors I had invited dared to move an inch. Not Jessica Miller, 35 years old. My calculating daughter-in-law who sat right beside her husband dressed in a sharp black executive dress, looking far more like she was sitting across a hostile corporate merger table than attending a family celebration. And not even Kyle himself standing there with his wrinkled suit, glassy eyes, and a loose bow tie dangling pathetically around his neck. That was when Hal Sutton, my neighbor of 15 uninterrupted years whom I had considered a friend, slowly raised his smartphone in the air, keeping the camera lens leveled right at my bleeding face. That was when everything I had built, sacrificed, and protected for 38 long years shattered completely in the space of a single vicious slap. The dead silence that followed the impact was infinitely worse than the physical pain itself. Mrs. Gardner let out a sharp, horrified gasp. Hal's phone remained held high, glowing ominously as it recorded every humiliating detail. Jessica's facial expression never flickered once. She merely watched the unfolding catastrophe with cold, analytical eyes, calculating something deeply sinister that my tired mind couldn't possibly decipher. Kyle's hand dropped slowly to his side, and for a fleeting, desperate microsecond I thought I caught a flicker of genuine human regret wash across his flushed face. But it instantly hardened back into something much uglier, a dark, twisted sense of smug satisfaction and profound relief, as if an exhausting theatrical performance was finally over. "Come on, Jessica," Kyle spat out harshly, turning on his heel. "We're walking out of here right now." They strode toward the front door without offering another single word of explanation. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind them with a deafening rattle. My 4 neighbors sat frozen around the table, utterly paralyzed, awkwardly unsure whether they should offer me a comforting word or pretend they hadn't just witnessed my total social and familial destruction. I think we really should be going, Vernon," Hal said quietly, finally lowering his phone, his face flushing with awkward guilt. I nodded numbly, unable to form words. They packed up in a hurried rush, desperate to escape the toxic wreckage of what was supposed to be a simple, joyful birthday celebration. I sat completely alone at the head of the long dining table for a very long time, my bruised cheek throbbing fiercely while the untouched birthday cake sat nearby, mocking me with its cheerful unlit candles. How on earth does a father's lifelong devotion and unconditional love curdle into this? A violent hand striking across the face and a neighbor's camera capturing every agonizing frame for public consumption. By 11 o'clock that night, my smartphone began vibrating incessantly against the wooden table and would not stop. Hal Sutton had gone ahead and uploaded the unedited video directly to his Facebook profile. Within 2 short hours, the post had already been aggressively shared over 400 times across local community groups. By midnight, the footage had gone viral across the entire state of Tennessee, picked up by regional aggregator pages. By 2 o'clock in the morning, complete strangers from 3 different states were flooding the comment sections, hurling insults at the spoiled, arrogant son who had physically assaulted his elderly father on his birthday, while simultaneously mocking me for being a weak, pathetic old man who couldn't command respect in his own home. Numb with shock, I turned off my phone completely, picked it up, and carried it into the quiet living room, sitting down on the rug with a heavy cardboard box filled with old, faded photographs. I pulled out pictures of Kyle at age 3, gap-toothed and grinning with innocent joy. Pictures of Kyle at age 10, standing proudly beside his very first bicycle that I had stayed up all night assembling. Pictures of Kyle at age 15, already pulling away, already looking at me with undisguised contempt, already finding my blue-collar life entirely insufficient for his grand ambitions. But my beloved wife, Clara, had passed away 8 years prior after sharing 40 years of marriage with me. As I flipped through those dusty photo albums in the dead of night, a sudden piercing memory struck me. I vividly recalled the strange, haunting sadness that used to linger deep within Clara's eyes every single time she looked at Kyle on his birthday. It wasn't ordinary sadness. It was something vastly heavier, a dark, suffocating secret that I had foolishly never understood or probed into during all our decades together. "Are you truly happy, Vernon?" she had asked me once, late at night on the exact date Kyle was born, with hot tears streaming down her pale face as she cradled the infant in her arms. "Of course I'm happy, Clara." I had laughed softly back then, kissing her forehead. "He's our healthy son. We finally have our boy." But looking back through the cold lens of hindsight, I realized there had been something genuinely desperate in the tight, white-knuckled way she had clutched that baby against her chest that night. Something I had dismissively blamed entirely on utter physical exhaustion, the undeniable trauma of a difficult childbirth, and standard new mother anxiety. Now, sitting alone in the dark shadows at 3 o'clock in the morning while my bruised cheek burned, I shuddered as I finally wondered what monumental, terrifying truth I had blindly missed all those years ago. I must have finally dozed off in the armchair, exhausted from the physical pain and the emotional wreckage, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was streaming harshly through the living room windows, and my cell phone was ringing violently against the wooden coffee table. An unknown number flashed across the screen. For a brief second, I almost ignored it, assuming it was just another curious internet stranger or a local reporter trying to track down the old man from the viral video. But something in my gut compelled me to pick it up. "Hello?" Mr. Miller, a frail elderly woman's voice trembled through the speaker, laden with deep age, profound exhaustion, and an undeniable undercurrent of absolute terror. "My name is Dr. Blanche Rivera. I am 75 years old, and I am currently dying of terminal cancer. 38 years ago, I was the attending obstetrician who delivered your son at Memphis General Hospital." I sat up straight in an instant, a sudden, piercing wave of cold sweat washing over me despite the oppressive June heat radiating through the house. "I had seen that viral video circulating online the previous night," she continued, each careful word heavy with decades of suppressed guilt. "Watching that young man publicly strike his elderly father across the face on his birthday broke something inside my soul, making me realize with absolute clarity that I simply could not take this monstrous secret down to my grave any longer." "What secret?" I rasped, my throat suddenly dry as bone. Her voice broke into a ragged sob. "Mr. Miller, I have kept my silence for far too long, and it has rotted away my conscience. The words I am about to tell you will shatter 38 years of your life in a single breath. Your wife, Clara, switched the babies while both exhausted mothers were fast asleep in the maternity ward." I gripped the edge of the wooden coffee table so hard my knuckles turned stark white, my coffee mug entirely forgotten, pressing the phone so hard against my ear that it physically hurt. Dr. Blanche Rivera's trembling voice poured through the speaker, each devastating word dropping like a heavy stone into still water. "It was June 14th, 1985 at Memphis General Hospital. You and your wife, Clara, were anxiously waiting in the maternity ward. Your biological baby boy was born late at night, at 11:42 p.m. She paused, her breath rattling painfully in her chest. "He was born with severe permanent cognitive developmental delays. The pediatric specialist gently explained to you both that he would likely never learn to speak properly, never read a book, and never possess the capacity to run a business or live independently." Your wife heard the word never, and something inside her broke permanently. A cold shudder ran down my spine as I remembered Clara's pale, haunted face on that exact night, the hot tears I had foolishly attributed to sheer physical exhaustion, and the desperate, white-knuckled way she had clutched that newborn infant to her chest as if he might vanish into thin air. Clara was utterly terrified of your reaction. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Blanche continued, her voice cracking with remorse, "she had listened to you talk for months about how your future son would inherit your beloved auto repair shop, carry on the proud Miller name, and take over your legacy. She became utterly convinced in her frantic state that you would utterly reject a child who couldn't fulfill those high expectations. She was completely convinced that you expected absolute perfection." There was another young mother in the ward. Dr. Blanche pushed onward, her tone dropping into a confidential whisper. "Rennie Henderson, just 18 years old, unmarried, entirely alone, and terrified out of her mind, yet fiercely determined to keep her baby no matter the cost. She had given birth an hour before Clara, a completely healthy baby boy with zero complications. While both exhausted mothers were heavily sedated, your wife found me lingering alone in the hallway." Dr. Blanche let out a choked cry. "I was 37 years old back then, drowning under a crushing mountain of medical schools and student loan debt. Your wife offered me $50,000 in cash. More money than I had ever seen in my entire life. She begged, pleaded, and manipulated me into giving you the healthy baby instead. She swore up and down that she was saving you from lifelong disappointment, saving her marriage, and saving everything she held dear. You switched them?" The words felt like jagged shards of glass tearing through my throat. "God forgive me, yes," she wept. "I waited until 3:00 a.m. when both mothers were deeply sedated. I switched the hospital wristbands, falsified all the official birth records, and deliberately told young Renee that her baby boy had been born with severe cognitive delays. She believed me completely. Why wouldn't she? Medical doctors don't lie about tragedies like that." The entire living room spun violently around me. I lost my balance and sank heavily into the armchair. "Renee Henderson took my biological son home thinking he was hers, while I took home a stranger's child. never knowing the cruel deception. "Where is he?" My voice emerged as a hoarse, broken whisper. "Where is my true son?" "His name is Sawyer Henderson," Dr. Blanche answered, giving me the final piece of the puzzle. "He is a talented carpenter working in Hartsville, roughly 40 minutes away from you." Renee raised him entirely on her own, working 2 grueling jobs, pouring every single penny she earned toward corrective surgeries and physical therapy for his foot. She loved that boy with a fierce, unconditional devotion greater than anything I have ever witnessed. Dr. Blanche's voice softened slightly as she reached the end of her confession. She passed away 3 years ago from cancer, but before she went, she made certain Sawyer knew he was loved beyond measure. I sat in absolute, suffocating silence in the kitchen for an entire hour after the call ended, watching the morning light slowly creep across the floorboards. How is a man supposed to process the sudden destruction of 38 years of reality? How do you mourn a son you raised and poured your soul into for nearly 4 decades, while simultaneously mourning the son you never even knew existed? Yet as staggering and horrifying as Dr. Blanche's confession was, a much darker, more insidious revelation was waiting in the shadows, a twist of such calculated malice that it made the hospital switch of 1985 look like a simple mistake. Unbeknownst to Dr. Blanche, and entirely unknown to me until this very moment, this wasn't the first time this earth-shattering secret had surfaced. 5 years prior, when Dr. Blanche's cancer had first returned and she felt the cold shadow of mortality closing in, she had made the exact same phone call to our house, intending to confess her sins to my wife Clara before taking them to the grave. Clara was already very sick herself at that time, battling the final stages of her own illness, but someone else had answered the household extension first. Someone had stood quietly in the hallway, pressing their ear against the receiver, overheated and listening to every single terrifying syllable of Dr. Blanche's confession. That person was Kyle. He had overheard the entire conversation between Dr. Blanche and my late wife 5 years ago. He had known the absolute truth about his biological origins for half a decade. He knew precisely that he carried none of my blood, that he was the product of a criminal hospital switch, and that the Miller name and fortune did not legally or biologically belong to him. But did he come forward like an honest man? Did he express shock, confusion, or a desire to find his real parents? Absolutely not. Instead, calculating the immense financial leverage this catastrophic secret provided, Kyle and his cold, calculating wife Jessica had chosen to weaponize the information as the ultimate tool for corporate-style extortion. They had kept the secret tightly locked away in their back pockets, biding their time, carefully monitoring my health, and waiting for the exact right moment to strike. They deliberately engineered a multi-year psychological campaign against me, culminating in last night's vicious birthday ambush, where they demanded immediate access to $3 million in accumulated assets, not merely out of standard greed, but out of a desperate, panicked race against time to loot my entire estate before the dark truth was ever independently discovered and legally dismantled. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train, freezing the blood in my veins. The slap across my face wasn't merely an outburst of drunken disrespect. It was an act of cold, calculated violence committed by a ruthless imposter who realized his extortion plot was stalling, a desperate predator lashing out because he feared the old man was finally waking up to reality. The son I had loved, protected, and forgiven for 38 years had turned out to be a parasitic fraud who had spent the last 5 years plotting how to strip me bare while laughing behind my back. As I sat there in the quiet morning light, the lingering physical pain in my bruised cheek vanished entirely, replaced by an absolute, unshakable coldness. The game they had been playing in the dark was officially over, and the real reckoning was about to begin. The heavy weight of Dr. Blanche Rivera's midnight confession still lingered in my mind like a thick, suffocating fog as I slid behind the steering wheel of my truck and pointed the hood toward Hartsville, Tennessee. The journey took roughly 40 minutes along winding asphalt roads flanked by sprawling green pastures and quiet southern pines, but every single mile felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, torn violently between the agonizing betrayal of the man I had raised for nearly 4 decades and the haunting, unanswered questions surrounding the biological son I never knew existed. When I finally rolled into the small, dusty town of Hartsville, I easily located the tin-roofed building situated near the edge of the industrial district, bearing a simple, weather-beaten wooden sign that read Henderson Carpentry. A rich, unmistakable aroma of freshly sawed oak and sweet pine drifted lazily out into the warm June air, mingling with the distant, steady scream of an industrial buzzsaw echoing from inside. I killed the engine, sat in the cab for a long, tense moment trying to steady my racing heartbeat, and then pushed open the driver's side door to step out onto the gravel. As I walked across the threshold into the sunlit interior of the workshop, the buzzsaw abruptly whined down and fell silent, leaving a thick, reverent quiet in its wake. Standing near the center of the spacious room was a man in his late 30s, wearing a canvas work apron heavily dusted with fine wood shavings. He had a compact, sturdy build, dark hair, and sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately locked onto mine with quiet, grounded recognition. But what caught my attention instantly was the way he stood. His left foot turned slightly inward with each subtle shift in weight, a permanent physical reminder of the clubfoot that his late mother, Renee, had spent her life working 2 grueling jobs to correct through surgeries and physical therapy. This was Sawyer Henderson, my true flesh and blood. Yet, standing there face to face for the very first time in 38 years, we were complete strangers separated by a chasm of decades filled with lies we didn't author. Mr. Miller Sawyer greeted me smoothly, his voice carrying a calm, unhurried warmth as he wiped fine sawdust from his hardened palms with a clean cotton rag. "I remember you. You brought in that transmission invoice from Miller's garage a couple of years back. You're the mechanic from Oak Ridge." A sudden, sharp lump formed in my throat, making it difficult to swallow. The air felt tight and electric. "You remember me?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Of course I do," Sawyer replied, with a faint, polite smile that showed immense pride in his trade without an ounce of arrogance. "I spent 3 days inside your shop custom building those solid oak storage shelves for your back parts bay. Best oak you could ask for. Straight lines, tight joints." As those words echoed off the metal rafters, the final, stunning puzzle piece snapped into place inside my head with blinding clarity. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. 2 years ago, Sawyer Henderson had walked into my auto repair shop as an anonymous contractor, spent 3 days meticulously crafting magnificent oak shelving units with his own calloused hands, and flat out refused my offer to stain them, insisting that genuine quality wood should always stand strong on its own natural merits. And right beside him during those exact 3 days had been Kyle, my ungrateful, lazy adopted son who had lazily popped into the shop, complained endlessly about money, and watched me loudly praise the anonymous carpenter's exceptional work while bitterly wishing aloud that Kyle could possess half of that man's dedicated work ethic and character. Kyle had stood merely 3 feet away from his true biological counterpart, completely oblivious, while I had stood right beside my actual flesh and blood, admiring his master craftsmanship without having the slightest earthly clue that the universe was trying to hand me back the truth I never knew I lost. I struggled to find the right words to bridge the impossible gap between us. I needed to tell him everything, about Dr. Blanche's dying confession, about the criminal hospital swap of 1985, and about the parasitic fraud who had stolen 38 years of my life. My hands trembled as I invited him to step outside away from the machinery, and as we sat down on the weathered wooden steps leading up to the shop's side entrance while summer cicadas hummed loudly in the oak trees overhead, I poured out the entire horrifying truth. I told him about the maternity ward in Memphis, the $50,000 bribe, the falsified birth records, and the shocking phone call I had received just hours earlier. I bared my soul completely, laying out the raw, ugly wreckage of my family history to a man who owed me nothing. Sawyer listened to every single syllable with absolute terrifying stillness. He did not interrupt, he did not gasp in shock, and he did not throw his hands up in anger. His knuckles rested evenly on his knees, turning stark white as he processed the monumental weight of a lie that had spanned 4 decades. Yet, when I finally finished my confession and sat there waiting for the inevitable explosion of emotion, Sawyer did something that completely disarmed me. He let out a long, slow breath, turned his calm, steady gaze toward me, and quietly refused to accept the narrative I was desperately trying to force upon him. "You came here looking to fix the past, Mr. Miller," Sawyer said, his tone entirely devoid of bitterness or hostility, carrying instead a profound, transcendent maturity that left me utterly speechless. "You came here with a DNA theory and a dying doctor's guilt, looking for a son to replace the one who broke your heart. But you're forgetting something vital. I already had a mother. Her name was Renee Henderson. She worked herself to the bone day and night, scrubbing floors and taking extra shifts just to pay for the surgeries that allowed me to walk straight. She loved me fiercely, perfectly, and unconditionally through every single hardship life threw our way." He paused, shifting his weight slightly, his eyes locking deep into mine with an unyielding intensity that made me feel like an emotional child. "And you want to know something else, Mr. Miller? My mother knew the truth long before you did." The revelation struck me like a bolt of lightning out of a clear blue sky. What do you mean she knew?" I stammered, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. 15 years ago, when I was 23 years old and trying desperately to make a modest living as an apprentice carpenter in Nashville, Dr. Blanche Rivera tracked my mother down and made the exact same confession over the telephone, Sawyer revealed softly, the words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet afternoon air. "My mother listened to the doctor explain the entire hospital switch, She learned that I wasn't her biological child by blood, and that another family somewhere out there was living a lie. But do you know what my mother did after she hung up that phone? She sat down at our kitchen table, looked at me with tears in her eyes, and decided right then and there to do absolutely nothing about it. Tears welled up uninvited in my own eyes as I stared at him in utter disbelief. "Why?" I whispered, my voice breaking completely. "Why would she choose to keep such a crushing secret?" "Because my mother understood something fundamental that you and your wife clearly never grasped," Sawyer answered steadily, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man anchored by pure love. "She knew with absolute certainty that true family isn't forged by cold biology matching DNA strands or hospital wristbands. Family is forged by sleepless nights, scraped knees, unwavering loyalty, and the daily, unglamorous choice to stay and fight for someone when things get hard. She told me back then, 'Sawyer, you might not be my flesh and blood, but you are my son in every single way that truly counts on this earth.' She chose silence not out of cowardice, but out of fierce, protective love. She refused to shatter my world or tear open old wounds just to satisfy a technicality on a piece of paper. The sheer nobility, grace, and emotional intelligence radiating from this man, whom I had never raised, never provided for, and never mentored, cut straight through my hardened defenses and laid bare every single failure of my life. While I had spent 38 years pouring my unconditional love and financial resources into an ungrateful, narcissistic sociopath who ultimately repaid my devotion with a violent slap across the face, Renee Henderson had raised a true gentleman in the quiet backwoods of Tennessee, instilling within him a deep, unbreakable sense of personal integrity and emotional maturity that money could never buy. The stark contrast between the son I thought I had built and the son I had accidentally abandoned overwhelmed me entirely. Sitting there on those dusty wooden steps under the hot Tennessee sun, listening to the gentle hum of the summer cicadas, I realized with profound, agonizing clarity just how deeply flawed my entire existence had been. I had spent my whole life measuring success in terms of automotive transmissions, shop revenue, and $3 million in accumulated bank accounts, completely blind to the reality that true human worth is measured entirely by character, forgiveness, and the quiet dignity of honest labor. Sawyer did not hate me, nor did he welcome me with open, tearful arms. He simply looked at me as an aging, broken stranger who had wandered into his workshop carrying a heavy burden of regret that he alone was forced to carry home. And as I sat there in silence, wrestling with the overwhelming weight of his words, I knew that if I ever wanted to earn even a fraction of the respect this remarkable man possessed, I would have to stand up, face the toxic wreckage waiting for me back in Oak Ridge, and dismantle the lies of my life down to the very last bolt. The quiet, sterile environment of the Nashville Medical Laboratory felt a million miles away from the roaring industrial saws of Hartsville and the tense, broken memories of my home in Oak Ridge. The waiting room smelled sharply of industrial antiseptic and stale, lukewarm coffee, featuring rows of stiff blue plastic chairs bolted to the floor beneath fluorescent lights that hummed at an irritatingly high frequency. I sat rigidly in one of those chairs, staring blankly at the wall, waiting for the 3 agonizing days of processing to conclude. It had been precisely 72 hours since Sawyer and I had stood side by side in a small, windowless clinic room, watching a calm nurse gently swab the inside of our cheeks before labeling the specimen vials. Those 3 days dragged by like an eternity, filled with restless pacing, haunted sleeplessness, and the terrifying weight of a truth that was about to permanently alter the landscape of my twilight years. At exactly 8:55 in the morning, right on schedule, a familiar rugged pickup truck pulled into the laboratory parking lot. Sawyer stepped out, moved with his characteristic steady determination despite his slight limp, and pushed open the front glass door. We exchanged a quiet, respectful nod without speaking a word, 2 men bound by a silent covenant of blood and history, before a lab technician named Diana Fletcher called our names and led us down a short, sterile hallway to her private consultation office. Diana sat behind a polished wooden desk, placed a thick manila envelope squarely between us, and delivered the definitive verdict with the practiced, emotionless professionalism of someone who had witnessed both miraculous redemptions and absolute devastation within those 4 walls. When I pulled the formal document from its sleeve and scanned past the dense technical jargon, my eyes instantly locked onto the single statistic that mattered above all else. Probability of paternity 99.8%. The heavy paper trembled slightly between my calloused fingers. 38 years of carefully curated lies, institutional corruption, and parental devotion distilled down to a single unassailable decimal point. It was undeniably, mathematically true. Sawyer Henderson was my biological son. We shared a quiet, lingering moment of mutual acknowledgement in that small office before parting ways, both of us carrying the crushing gravity of the science back out into the bright, unforgiving June sunshine. But as I drove the winding asphalt highway back toward Oak Ridge, a dark, sinking premonition settled into my stomach. Knowing the truth was only half the battle. Surviving the vicious, cornered predators who had built their entire livelihoods on top of the lie was about to require every ounce of resilience I had left. When I pulled my truck into the driveway of my house, just past 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Jessica Miller's expensive black sedan was already parked aggressively blocking the garage door. She stood waiting on the front porch, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, dressed in a sharp designer blazer, her face carved into an expression of cold, corporate hostility. The June heat shimmered violently off the hot asphalt, but the air around her felt absolute zero. I stepped slowly out of my truck, shutting the driver's side door with a heavy thud, and let the immense weight of the last few days settle squarely into my chest. "Vernon?" She greeted me immediately, her voice as smooth and lethal as glass sliding across a concrete floor. "We need to have a serious, uninterrupted conversation right now." "Then talk," I said calmly, walking past her up the wooden steps and unlocking the front door. "I'm listening." Inside the house, Jessica did not wait to be invited. She marched straight into the living room, perched herself on the edge of the sofa with her hands neatly folded in her lap like she was attending a hostile corporate buyout meeting, and immediately launched her offensive. "I heard through reliable channels that you've been running around asking dangerous, unverified questions, digging into dusty old hospital records from decades ago," she began, her eyes narrowing with predatory calculation. "It's completely upsetting, Kyle. He is deeply confused, emotionally wounded, and feels entirely betrayed by the fact that his own father is actively trying to hunt down strangers to replace him." "Is that so?" I asked quietly, keeping my hands steady at my sides as I stood refusing to sit down. She nodded with practiced sincerity, her tone dripping with fake empathy. "He feels like you're trying to push him out of the family legacy." "Replace him?" I repeated, the irony tasting like ash on my tongue. "With Sawyer," she replied smoothly, dropping the carpenter's name as if it were a common nuisance. "The local carpenter. The biological son you suddenly discovered." I studied her face closely, calm, highly rehearsed, entirely devoid of genuine human emotion, waiting patiently for me to soften and yield. Every single manipulative word she uttered sounded like it had been carefully scripted by a high-priced corporate defense attorney. Instead of showing anger, I decided to finally strip away her protective armor. "Let me ask you a very direct question, Jessica," I said, my voice dropping into a low, steady register. "Did you and Kyle happen to know that Kyle took an independent DNA test on his own volition roughly 2 years ago?" Her flawless, composed expression did not shatter, but her manicured fingers tightened violently against her knee, just enough to betray the sudden spike of adrenaline racing through her veins. "What on earth are you talking about, Vernon?" she stammered, a fraction of her iron control slipping away. 2 years ago," I repeated steadily, "right around the exact time Sawyer was building those custom oak shelves out in my auto shop garage, Kyle quietly visited a private medical lab and submitted his DNA. He knew there was a discrepancy. Did you know about that test?" She hesitated for a beat too long, a fatal pause in any negotiation. We merely wanted absolute legal certainty," she admitted defensively, her voice pitching up slightly. "About the estate planning, about the family business, about where we officially stood regarding your future assets." The living room fell into an absolute suffocating tomb of silence. "So you did know," I said, the trap finally springing shut. Her eyes widened in sheer horror as she abruptly realized what she had just accidentally confessed under pressure. "Vernon, I didn't mean. You knew he took that test." I cut her off sharply, my voice ringing with righteous fury. "You undoubtedly suggested it to him. You probably even paid the lab fees out of your own pocket. You've been sitting on this catastrophic secret for 2 full years, using it as a ticking time bomb to orchestrate a financial hostile takeover of everything I've built." Seeing her elaborate web of deception completely disintegrate before her eyes, Jessica instantly abandoned all pretense of polite diplomacy, dropping the mask of the grieving relative to reveal the ruthless, unadulterated opportunist lurking underneath. She leaped up from the couch, her face turning crimson with rage, pointing an accusatory finger directly at my face. "Fine, you want to play hardball, you stubborn old fool?" she shrieked, her voice losing all professional composure. "You think you can just cut us out after we spent years managing your declining life? Listen to me very carefully, Vernon Miller. If you refuse to immediately sign over those assets and legally transfer the shop and accounts into our names before the end of this week, I will personally ensure your total destruction. My legal team is already retained and ready to act. We will take that viral video of your son striking you, the one that has already been viewed by millions across Tennessee, and we will weaponize it in the civil courts. We will successfully sue you for severe elder abuse, emotional negligence, systemic financial alienation, and public defamation of character. We will paint you to the entire state as an abusive, mentally unstable patriarch who drove his own children to despair, and we will legally strip you of every single penny you own through court-mandated damages." The sheer, staggering malice of her threat hit me with the force of a physical blow, driving the breath straight out of my lungs. She wasn't merely attempting to manipulate me anymore. She was threatening to use my own public humiliation, the very trauma of being physically assaulted by my adopted son on my birthday, as an extortion tool to rob me of my life's work. The venomous audacity of her plot left me entirely speechless for a fleeting second, backed firmly against the edge of the living room wall with nowhere left to run. But standing there in the suffocating June heat, looking into the cold, calculating eyes of a woman who would gladly destroy an old man's entire dignity for a multi-million-dollar payout, the dense fog of doubt in my mind vanished completely. The gentle, forgiving father who had spent 38 years making excuses for an ungrateful household died right at that moment. The tattered remnants of my patience evaporated, leaving behind a cold, unyielding resolve of a man who realized that mercy shown to a predator is nothing more than active suicide. I looked straight into her terrified, furious eyes, drew in a long, steady breath, and made the definitive, irreversible decision that would permanently crush their parasitic empire down to the very dust. After Jessica stormed out of the house in a blind rage, slamming the front door so violently that the glass panes rattled in their wooden frames, the living room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The echoes of her vicious threats, her promise to weaponize my viral video, sue me for elder abuse, and strip me of everything I had spent 40 years building, still hung heavily in the air like a poisonous cloud. But I did not allow myself to freeze or hesitate. The time for passive endurance and quiet grief was permanently over. With a cold, unyielding resolve hardening in my chest, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, dialed Kyle's direct number, and waited through 3 long, agonizing rings until he finally picked up. His voice sounded frantic, defensive, and deeply unnerved, as he demanded to know why I was calling after what had just transpired with his wife. I did not waste time exchanging pleasantries or softening the blow. I told him in a low, uncompromising register that he had exactly 1 hour to drive over to the house, step through the front door, and sit down at the dining room table for dinner alongside Sawyer Henderson. Kyle stammered uselessly, desperately trying to protest, but I cut him off sharply, informing him with absolute finality that if he refused to show his face, the doors of Miller's garage and transmission would be locked to him forever, and every remaining financial lifeline he thought he had would be instantaneously severed. Before he could cough up another frantic excuse, I pressed the red button and ended the call, leaving him trapped in the terrifying reality of his own compounding choices. At precisely 6:30 in the evening, the front porch light flickered, and a soft, hesitant knock echoed through the quiet hallway. When I pulled the door open, Kyle stood on the threshold, looking entirely like a man whose entire universe had just violently collapsed around him. The arrogant, polished veneer of the high-flying corporate executive was completely gone. His expensive suit was rumpled and unkempt, his hair was messy, his eyes were bloodshot and deeply sunken from days of unmitigated panic, and his shoulders were hunched forward under an invisible weight. Stepping past him into the kitchen was Sawyer, who had arrived 10 minutes earlier with a quiet, grounded dignity, carrying himself with the steady assurance of a man whose self-worth was anchored in honest, calloused labor rather than inherited privilege. The contrast between my 2 sons, the biological child I never knew I had, and the adopted child who had spent decades weaponizing my affection, was staggering, painting a vivid picture of 2 entirely different human realities standing under a single roof. I had prepared something entirely simple and unassuming for the evening meal: roasted chicken, steamed rice, and green beans, the exact kind of comforting, unpretentious comfort food my late wife Clara used to cook on cold winter nights when life felt overwhelmingly heavy. I set 3 plain white plates on the long dining room table, sitting precisely in the same room where Kyle had viciously struck me across the face just a little over a week prior, and where I had spent 8 long years eating in total solitude. We all sat down at the table, but the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a butcher's knife. The meal proceeded in a state of profound, agonizing silence. Not a single word was spoken as we passed the bowls of food, as silverware scraped quietly against porcelain, or as water was poured into glasses. It was a tense, psychological standoff between 2 worlds. One man who had spent his entire life addicted to the effortless pursuit of luxury and unearned entitlement, and another man who had spent his entire existence learning the sacred, unbreakable value of sweating for every single inch of ground he walked on. Sawyer ate calmly and methodically, showing no hostility, no smug triumph, and no bitter resentment toward the man who had occupied his rightful place for 38 years. Kyle, on the other hand, barely touched the food on his plate. His hands trembled violently as he gripped his fork, his eyes darting frantically between Sawyer and me, haunted by the sudden, terrifying realization that his entire fabricated existence had completely evaporated. When the agonizing meal finally drew to a close, Kyle pushed his untouched plate away with a faint metallic clatter and stared down at the polished wood of the table, his chest heaving with suppressed emotion. That was when the final, devastating blow of his personal tragedy completely destroyed what little composure he had left. In a choked, ragged whisper that barely carried across the table, Kyle confessed the horrifying reality of what had happened just an hour before he arrived at my house. Celine, or rather, Jessica, his calculating, ruthless wife, had completely abandoned him the moment she realized their extortion plot had disintegrated and their legal crusade against my estate was dead in the water. She had packed up all her luxury designer luggage in the middle of the afternoon while he was out, emptied their shared secondary checking accounts down to the very last cent, and left behind a cold, typed legal notice informing him that her high-priced divorce attorneys had already filed formal dissolution papers. She had used him solely as a disposable corporate pawn to infiltrate my wealth, and the second the multi-million-dollar payout slipped through her manicured fingers, she had discarded him like a piece of broken trash without a single shred of human remorse. Hearing the absolute devastation in his voice, watching the man I had raised for nearly 4 decades break down into raw, uncontrollable sobbing, a heavy, aching wave of paternal grief flooded my soul. He was a deeply flawed, incredibly greedy, and profoundly misguided human being who had committed unforgivable acts against my dignity. Yet, sitting right in front of me, he was also a tragic victim of his own unbridled greed and the toxic manipulation of a woman who never loved him. I did not yell at him, nor did I offer cold, sarcastic comfort. Instead, I stood up slowly from my chair, walked over to the mahogany sideboard, and retrieved a plain white business envelope I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I walked back, placed it gently on the table right in front of his trembling hands, and spoke with a firm, steady compassion. "Inside this envelope is a certified cashier's check for $20,000, Kyle," I said quietly, watching his tear-filled eyes snap up to meet mine. "It is a clean, honest capital startup fund, not a single penny more, and certainly not a bailout for your past debts. It is just enough legitimate financial backing for you to pack up what remains of your life, move far away from Oak Ridge, and start completely over from the bottom up, building an honest living with your own 2 hands the hard way. But understand this with absolute clarity. This is the very last financial assistance you will ever receive from my name. From this second forward, you are entirely on your own." Kyle stared down at the envelope as if it were a physical lifeline thrown to a drowning man in the middle of a freezing ocean. Fat, heavy tears spilled uncontrollably over his lower eyelids, tracking down his flushed cheeks and splashing heavily against the paper. He did not reach out to grab it immediately. Instead, with agonizingly slow movements, his shaking hand reached beneath the cuff of his wrinkled suit sleeve and unfastened a heavy, gleaming gold watch resting against his wrist. It was the exact same pristine 18-karat gold watch I had proudly presented to him as a milestone gift on his 18th birthday, proudly engraved on the back with the words, "To Kyle with endless pride and love." Dad, he slid the expensive timepiece across the polished wooden table until it came to a soft stop right beside my plate. Beside the watch, he laid down a small, torn scrap of lined notebook paper, upon which he had scrawled just 3 simple, heartbreaking words in his own messy handwriting. "I'm sorry, Dad." Those 3 handwritten words carried the devastating, final weight of a 38-year chapter closing forever in total ruin. He did not wait for me to offer a parting blessing, nor did he look over at Sawyer, who watched the emotional exchange with quiet, respectful solemnity. Kyle pushed his chair back, stood up on trembling legs, and walked slowly toward the front door without uttering another single syllable. I sat at the head of the table in absolute silence, watching him disappear out into the cool June evening, knowing full well that while the bitter tragedy of his greed had thoroughly destroyed the family we thought we had, it had simultaneously cleared away the toxic debris, leaving behind the raw, painful space where true, honest healing could finally begin to take root. The morning sun broke gently over the quiet town of Oak Ridge, casting a warm, golden illumination across the asphalt parking lot of Miller's Garage and Transmission, where 40 unbroken years of sweat, grease, and honest labor had built the foundation of my entire existence. The bitter shock of Kyle's betrayal, the devastating sting of Jessica's malicious extortion plots, and the haunting ghosts of the 1985 hospital room had finally settled into a deep, steady calm within my soul. The time for reckoning had passed, and the sacred time for rebuilding had officially arrived. 2 days after Kyle walked out of my front door into the cool June twilight, leaving behind his 18-year-old gold watch and a tear-stained scrap of paper, Sawyer Henderson and I drove side by side in my battered truck down to downtown Oak Ridge to visit the polished, mahogany-paneled offices of Robert Whitmore, our trusted estate and inheritance attorney. Robert Whitmore was a meticulous, silver-haired man in his mid-60s, sporting classic reading glasses perched delicately on the bridge of his nose and possessing an encyclopedic mastery of Tennessee inheritance and property law that had guided my business affairs for over 2 decades. Yet, despite having handled my corporate portfolio for 20 years, Whitmore had never once met my family until this very morning. He sat comfortably across the polished oak table from Sawyer and me, his expression a mix of professional gravity and quiet curiosity as he fanned out thick stacks of legal documentation across the gleaming surface. "Miller, Mr. Henderson," Whitmore began, his voice steady, calm, and deeply reassuring as he adjusted his glasses. "We have finalized all the formal restructuring paperwork according to your precise instructions, Vernon. Let us review the asset distributions to ensure everything is legally airtight." He tapped his fountain pen against the first primary document, guiding our attention down the lines of legal prose. First, regarding the physical real estate assets, the residential property at 42 Oak Lane and the entire commercial structure housing Miller's garage, including all heavy diagnostic equipment, machinery inventory, client lists, and corporate goodwill. These holdings are to be transferred in their entirety, free and clear of any encumbrances, directly to Sawyer Henderson as primary legal heir and sole proprietor. Sawyer sat with his hands neatly folded on the table, listening with profound humility, his expression entirely free of greedy anticipation or arrogant triumph. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the immense weight of the responsibility being handed to him by a father he had only just discovered. Next, Whitmore continued, turning to the financial asset allocations, concerning the accumulated liquid capital reserves totaling just over $3 million. $2.5 million will be formally endowed to establish the Vernon Morgan Vocational Training Fund, a permanent charitable trust dedicated to providing specialized trade school scholarships, advanced automotive mechanics training, and carpentry apprenticeships for underprivileged youth right here in Putnam County. The remaining $500,000 will be allocated entirely at Sawyer's personal discretion for shop expansion and operational modernization. Whitmore slid the heavy documents across the table toward us, offering his pen. "If you both are in complete agreement with these provisions, we can officially execute and notarize the transfer today." I did not hesitate for a second. I picked up the heavy fountain pen, feeling its balanced weight in my hand, and signed my legal name with a swift, unbroken stroke across the signature lines, permanently realigning 38 years of misplaced legacy into the hands of the son who had quietly built my shelves without ever asking for a reward. Sawyer followed suit, his hand pausing for just a fleeting moment over the signature line before he wrote out his name in careful, deliberate block letters, accepting the solemn duty of carrying our family name forward into the future. As Whitmore stepped out of the room temporarily to make certified duplicate copies for our permanent records, leaving Sawyer and me alone in the quiet office, a profound wave of peace washed over my chest. I looked at the man sitting across from me, my true biological son, whose remarkable character, unmatched work ethic, and quiet integrity had survived a lifetime of adversity without ever compromising his soul. "Do you want to know what the new official shop name is going to be, Sawyer?" I asked quietly with a gentle smile. Sawyer looked up from his paperwork, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "You're changing the name? I've already commissioned the custom metal sign," I told him. "From this day forward, the building will be known as Henderson and Morgan Auto. Your last name goes first." Sawyer stared at me in stunned silence, his throat working tightly as he struggled to find the right words. Why put Henderson first?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you earned it, son," I answered simply, placing my hand over his on the table. "You earned every single inch of it through your patience, your craftsmanship, and your unbreakable character." By the first week of September, the crisp autumn breeze began sweeping down from the Tennessee hills, bringing with it the magnificent, tangible proof of our new beginning. Above the wide entrance bays of the garage where the faded blue letters of Morgan Auto Repair had hung weathering the elements for 40 uninterrupted years, a brand new, bold black and white sign was securely mounted against the red brick facade. "Henderson and Morgan Auto." The words stood sharp, proud, and uncompromising against the morning sky. Sawyer now worked beside me 3 days a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, managing a newly constructed wood restoration and classic car interior custom division, brilliantly merging his master carpentry skills with traditional auto body work in ways I could have never previously imagined. We worked side by side in comfortable, companionable silence for hours on end, the alternating sounds of heavy wrenches clicking against steel, industrial sanders buzzing, and his precise industrial buzzsaw humming softly in the background, all while a classic country radio station played low from the corner shelf, mixing the rich, comforting aromas of motor oil and fresh sawdust. We rarely needed to speak much. Our actions, our shared respect, and the steady rhythm of our labor spoke volumes for us. Yet, even as our new life settled into a harmonious, healing routine, the lingering shadows of the past occasionally reminded me that closure is rarely a neat Hollywood-style event. It was late on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September when my smartphone buzzed quietly against my workbench. I picked it up to find an incoming email from an unknown encrypted sender. There was no accompanying subject line, no explanatory text in the body of the message, and no digital signature, just a single attached digital photograph. I tapped the screen to open the image, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. The photograph showed the front exterior of our newly branded shop, taken discreetly from across the street, roughly 100 feet away from behind the cover of a mature oak tree. The newly mounted metal sign, Henderson and Morgan Auto, was captured in razor-sharp high definition against the fading afternoon sky, both family names gleaming brilliantly in the light. There was no accompanying message or malicious threat attached. It was simply a silent, distant snapshot. But as I stared down at the glowing screen for a long, contemplative moment, I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty precisely who had taken that photograph. I knew it was Kyle. He had been standing out there alone in the empty street, perhaps during the early morning hours or late evening when traffic was minimal, standing close enough to clearly witness the legacy he had forfeited, yet far enough away to remain completely hidden in the shadows. My thumb hovered over the delete icon for a brief second, tempted to erase the reminder of the son who had broken my heart. But instead, I stopped, created a brand new folder within my inbox, moved the anonymous email securely inside, and labeled it with a single, unadorned word. Kyle. I did not reply to the message, nor did I send out a frantic search party. I simply let it rest there, acknowledging that while some doors in life must slam shut to protect your sanity, others can safely remain cracked open just an inch, neither welcoming nor permanently locked. Standing there in the quiet sanctuary of the shop as the autumn dusk began to filter through the dusty windows, casting long peaceful shadows across the concrete floor, I finally understood the profound, ultimate truth behind the journey that had brought me to this exact moment. And as I reflect upon the devastating wreckage and the miraculous redemption that defined my 68th year on this earth, I want to leave you with the absolute core philosophy of our community here at *Dad's Ultimate Payback. True family justice does not lie in bitter, spiteful revenge, nor does it thrive on the destructive impulse to crush those who have deeply hurt you. True family justice lies in the courageous, agonizing choice to stand firmly by the unvarnished truth, to place your trust and legacy into the hands of those who have genuinely earned it through character rather than bloodline, and to bravely let go of toxic illusions and false hopes before it is tragically too late. I could theoretically be wrong about the complex mechanics of the human heart, but deep down inside my soul, I know with absolute certainty that I am not. If this story struck a resonant chord somewhere deep inside your spirit today, please take a moment to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear these words tonight. And subscribe to *Dad's Ultimate Payback so you never miss the powerful, transformative journeys waiting ahead. Thank you from the very bottom of my heart for staying with me until the final word. Your precious time means infinitely more to me than mere language can express. Always remember that while this narrative contains dramatized elements woven in for deeper moral reflection, the underlying truths about truth, mercy, and unconditional love are what truly matter most. Stay strong, keep your moral boundaries unyielding, and always take exceptionally good care of your heart.